Hello, I'm Meia Nouwens, and welcome back to part 2 of our special episode on the U.S. presidential election. In part 1, we spoke to Ewan Graham and John Rain on how a Biden presidency could impact U.S. foreign policy in the Asia-Pacific and Middle East. In this episode, we'll be discussing how U.S. relations with Russia and Latin America could change under a new administration and the policy challenges that Biden will face. We hope you enjoyed the episode. Ever since evidence emerged of Russian interference in the 2016 U.S. election, which saw Donald Trump take the White House, U.S.-Russian relations have worsened, especially among the Democratic Party. IISS Senior Fellow for Russia and Eurasia, Nigel Gould-Davies, addresses the risks and opportunities that may present themselves in Russia and its neighbors over the coming years. Welcome onto the show, Nigel. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you. Delighted to be here, Meia.
So what has been the reaction from leaders in Eurasia to Biden's election victory? I note particularly that Putin hasn't responded.
Yes, most of the leaders in the region have maintained form and protocol and duly phoned in their congratulations. There are some notable absences. The most significant is Putin. And contrast this with the situation in 2016 when Trump was first elected. It was the following day that Putin issued his congratulation and made it known that he had done so. And his silence on this occasion is very significant. Contrast that with Volodymyr Zelensky in Ukraine, who was quick to congratulate the president-elect on his victory. And I think there are reasons why Ukraine, among others in the region, will be happy and Russia unhappy with the election result.
And why is that?
This election has been uniquely significant for the U.S.-Russia relationship. What's at stake here is not only questions of foreign policy, how the two countries will relate to one another over the next 4 years. This is also part of an underlying systemic rivalry. Putin has sought to demonstrate the advantages of an authoritarian anti-democratic system of government. And we know in 2016 and also in 2020, he tried to, in various ways, sow dissent and confusion and chaos into the American political process at the time of the elections. And so America has faced an unprecedented challenge. For the first time, what's at stake has been not only the course of American politics, but the resilience of its regime. The question has been posed about the future of democracy itself in America. And this is extraordinary territory. And in fact, as we speak now, it's not yet clear that Donald Trump will accept the outcome of the election. He is behaving in a way that democratic leaders do not normally do. We've yet to see how far that goes and whether he will try to resist the orderly transition of power in a democracy. But come back to the fundamental point. If international relations are defined by a struggle between systems of government and not just relations between states, then we are reaching a critical moment here.
How will a Biden administration impact Russia relations or relations in Eurasia?
Well, as things stand now, U.S.-Russia relations are extremely poor at their lowest point since the early 1980s before Mikhail Gorbachev came to power. There's every reason to think that a Biden presidency will make things even more difficult for Russia. Firstly, some of Biden's underlying priorities intrinsically challenge Russia's objectives. Biden will seek to repair America's alliances that have frayed under Trump, and especially the Atlantic Alliance, of course. Secondly, Biden will restore the centrality of democratic solidarity to American foreign policy. Trump has said little or nothing about democracy and human rights in foreign policy, and Biden has made it very clear that he wants to revive that traditional but recently neglected theme in American policy. And thirdly, Biden will make a priority too of the global struggle against corruption. And that puts on warning corrupt regimes like Russia and others too in the region that they will no longer be able to use Western outlets, the rule of law in Western systems, to send and keep safely the illicit gains that have been made within their countries, and which they sometimes use to destabilize other countries as well. So that's the first thing. Russia, as it were, ticks all the wrong boxes as far as Biden's global priorities are concerned. The second issue, more Russia specific, is that Biden is not Trump in respect of his relationship with Putin. The Putin-Trump relationship remains mysterious. There is no other American president who has ever treated a major adversary with such apparent deference and willingness to please as Trump has of Putin. And Biden, by contrast, has made some very stern remarks about Putin and has personally been affected by Russia's support for malign narratives about Biden's own son, Hunter Biden, and his involvement in Ukraine. So I think this will be more difficult for Russia, but also for other countries that violate human rights and are corrupt as well.
And what challenges do you think the Biden administration itself will have to overcome over the next 4 years with regards to its Russia or Eurasia policies?
I think the first thing to say is that a Biden Russia policy will be very different from a Trump Russia policy, but it will have bipartisan support. So this will be an unusual case of a major policy change that will not be especially domestically controversial. One of the very few issues on which the Republicans in Congress have consistently parted company from their president has been Russia policy. So there'll be widespread support for a more assertive White House tone. This has been an exceptionally busy and turbulent few months for the region. Not only have we seen the attempted poisoning of the opposition leader Alexei Navalny, which has created a new crisis in the relationship with the West, we've also seen elections in Belarus, Kyrgyzstan, and Georgia, all to differing degrees create turbulence and instability. Especially in Kyrgyzstan, where we saw a complete change of government, and Belarus, where now 3 months on, we still have the streets of Minsk and beyond being filled with protesters who don't want to put up with Alexander Lukashenko any longer. But most severely and urgently of all, we have a war going on between Armenia and Azerbaijan over the enclave of Nagorno-Karabakh, and that looks as if it will. Well, it is escalating already. It is producing human rights tragedies as we speak, and could lead to larger regional implications there, and it will embolden Turkey as well, which has supported Azerbaijan. So there's a lot of instability of various degrees in the region, but also I think managing Russia as Russia approaches its own presidential election in 2024 will be critical as well. I think there's every reason to think that Russian foreign policy will become more adversarial, Russian domestic policy more authoritarian and repressive. So for all of those reasons, it's hard to be optimistic about the direction of travel of the U.S.-Russia relationship. One final point, and especially urgent, is that within a few days of Biden taking office on January 20th, the New START treaty is due to expire. This is the one remaining nuclear arms treaty still binding those two powers. And it's in both of their interests, it seems to me, to seek at least some form of extension in the short term. But that will, I think, be at the top of the in tray. It reminds us that for all of the difficulties and differences, there are still some common interests between those two countries.
So it'll expire just after he takes office, right? So there won't be, so it'll still largely be a Trump process, a Trump run process until January. Or will there be a handover of the negotiations for New START?
Biden will take office on January the 20th. New START is due to expire on February the 4th. So if Trump doesn't successfully negotiate at least a 1-year extension, as the Russians have been asking for, then Biden has a matter of a few days to sort that out. So that will be extremely urgent. And if that falls away, there's no restraint whatsoever on the numbers of strategic nuclear weapons that the two countries have.
If the Biden administration poses greater challenges to Russia over the next 4 years, do you think that that will result in closer relations between China and Russia? We've already heard Vladimir Putin, I believe, a couple of weeks ago say that in principle, Russia isn't opposed to forming an alliance with China, though that doesn't necessarily mean that that will happen. How do you view that relationship changing under a Biden administration?
I think that Russia will seek support and a closer relationship from China where it can. We've seen that relationship improve very significantly over the past 4 or 5 years. But ultimately, I think that that argument is oversold and that there is less to that relationship than meets the eye. Russia knows that China can be very tough and pragmatic in its dealings with Russia, and there are limits to the extent to which common interests push those two together. It would be especially wrong to think of this as some triangular relationship and that we must, or the West generally must pull Russia away from a closer relationship with China by softening its policy. We've occasionally heard that sort of argument, including from President Macron, and it really, in my view, does not stand up to scrutiny. So the relationship might improve further. They clearly have some common interests, but it's ultimately not in the gift of the West to decide what that relationship is. It should deal with each country on its own merits.
I mean, that doesn't sound very positive for a Trump administration, or at least a White House that I think is now solely focused on not just determining the election results, whether they were lawful or not, battling them out in court, but also, of course, thinking about more concerns closer to home with regards to presidential pardons and the like. How much focus will there be on continuing the negotiations on New START for the next coming months?
It's hard to be optimistic. I think that all the political energies now in the American political system will be consumed by domestic politics, ensuring that there is a stable and orderly transition. And ultimately, for all of the difficulties, let's hope that there is a positive story to tell about democracy here. It's sometimes said that Trump is the man the founders feared. It is precisely to guard against a demagogue like him that this elaborate system of checks and balances was created. Those checks and balances have faced their most severe test since the American Civil War. And if they remain intact, then that is a success story for democracy. It shows that an underperforming leader can be peacefully removed from office. That's something that does not happen in authoritarian states.
So, a last question then, perhaps. What opportunities will the Biden administration have with regards to its policies in the region?
It will have opportunities to build better and more disciplined and coherent and consistent relations with at least some of the countries. Biden has said in particular that he will make a priority of Ukraine, which of course has been a key controversial issue in the Trump presidency, indeed the underlying cause of his impeachment. So there'll be consistency. It doesn't mean that a Biden presidency should not be critical of areas where Ukraine or other countries fall short, but there will be more focus and a policy more consistent with underlying American values. The same is true of Belarus, where America has been pretty passive, actually, since the demonstrations began after the August 9th election. So there are opportunities to renew America's purpose and consistency in its policy across the region.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Nigel. Great insights.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you, Meia.
And finally, we speak with Irene Mia, Senior Fellow for Latin America. As Irene explains, Joe Biden is a familiar figure in Latin America, following numerous visits in his previous role as vice president under the Obama administration. However, the region is facing a range of political and economic challenges that have only become more acute as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. Irene addresses the various policy choices towards the region that Biden will face in the next 4 years. Hi, Irene. Thank you for joining us. It's great to have you on the podcast.
Hey, Meia. It's fantastic to be in the podcast, especially after those very exciting elections.
So, Latin America was a region that was quite neglected under the Trump presidency, and I understand that Biden already has some experience with the region. What was the reaction from Latin American leaders over the weekend?
Well, it's an interesting question because, as you said, it was probably one of the most neglected region by Trump. I think he just did one trip to the region to Buenos Aires for the G20 summit, and that's it. I guess it's an interesting question because, in a way, Trump had a very transactional and relationship with most of the region, and really kind of led by domestic policy considerations. So the big focus, as you know, was migration, or rather avoiding migrants to come to the U.S. And with very kind of hardline policies on war on drugs and migration, and also on Cuba and Venezuela. But at the same time, I think it was relatively easy for Latin American leaders to deal with him, because in a way, as long as they addressed the migration issue, then there was very little scrutiny on rule of law, very little scrutiny on environmental protection, very little scrutiny on freedom of the press, for instance, which we have seen deteriorating in the last few years. So I guess it's with Biden, of course, is going to be a much more sympathetic counterpart, but also a much more demanding counterpart. So I think issues that were in a way neglected as well, as I said, with respect, if you take Mexico, for instance, which was home of one of the most unlikely friendship between López Obrador, who is a left-wing populist, and Trump. There was a very good relationship between the two. I guess, obviously the migration issue and the building the walls wasn't very pleasant for Mexico or for López Obrador, but at the same time, there was very little scrutiny on labor law or environmental law, which is a fundamental part of the USMCA, which is the agreement which was signed with Trump to replace NAFTA. And I think this is something that is going to become quite central with Biden. So, yeah, I think it's going to be an interesting 4 years for both leaders, which were more kind of more far away from Trump, but also from leaders which were closer to Trump, including Bolsonaro in Brazil, López Obrador, and also leaders in Central America like Bukele, who were quite close to Trump, and for which, I guess, standards in terms of democratic of democracy and rule of law weren't as strong as they should have been.
I mean, what I think was interesting in the U.S. Elections has been the realization, perhaps, that the Latino community in the United States is quite divided over their preferences for Trump or Biden. And we saw a heavily split Latino community voting in the polls. Do you think that difference between different Latino communities will be also reflected in Latin America amongst leaders? Are there leaders in Latin America that still prefer Trump?
Yeah, I mean, I guess, as I said, for some leaders, it was probably an easier person to deal with, right? Apart from the rhetoric and the fact that he was being very dismissing and very disparaging with respect to the region. I guess it was, and I think I read an article somewhere about the relationship with López Obrador, saying that okay, once the López Obrador ensured that migrants weren't going through the wall, then he could do whatever he wanted in Mexico in a way. So I guess there is a bit of that. I guess in general, the main issue, even post Trump, is going to be migration, especially after the pandemic, which had devastating impact in the region. So I think it's fair to assume that there will be a new flow of migrants coming from the region, especially since Biden has won, right? So the people in Latin America know that this is something which is going to change. The approach is going to be much more sympathetic, much more similar to the past, and respectful of human rights. But in terms of split of the Latino community in the U.S., I think it's a bit of it's a bit biased in a way, because obviously you have the Cuban American and Venezuelan, which have very strong take against socialism and Cuba or Venezuela or the current regime, or should I say one of the regime in Venezuela at the moment, since we have had two parallel governments for the last 18 months or more. So yeah, I guess it's not exactly the same split in Latin America, but definitely you see a bit of that in terms of how to deal with Biden. I think for some leaders it's going to be a return to the past, but in a way a more demanding past. Also because Biden is going to be a much more informed interlocutor for the region, as you mentioned. He has been in charge of Latin America in the second Obama administration. He knows the region very well. He was actually put in charge of the crisis of child migrant in 2013. So he knows very well all the issues in the region.
So what are the challenges that Biden's administration will have to overcome in perhaps rebuilding the relationships with Latin American countries?
Well, I think there are going to be many challenges. I think, as with probably most of the world, for Biden is going to be really a post-war administration to a certain extent, right? So there are going to be so many fires to put down, so many priorities. Latin America is probably not going to be his first priority, of course. I do think Latin America is going to go up in importance in Biden tenure. Obviously there is also much more important interest on Biden part for Latin America, but also I think there are trends which make Latin America more important. As I said, the fact that the devastating impact of COVID in the region is likely to create more political instability and therefore more uncontrolled migration flows to the US. I think on a more positive note, Latin America can, and especially Central America, Mexico, and the Pacific Alliance can have an important role in building supply chain which are kind of closer to home, which is something that we have seen, after COVID becoming very important. There is also an issue of climate security for Latin America, which is very dear to Biden's heart. The Amazon, of course, are the lung of the planet, but also more in general, if you look at the development model in the region, they're very much based still around fossil fuel energy, which is obviously an issue for Biden. An example is López Obrador entire economic vision being based actually on boosting oil and coal. So it's a very different point of view from Biden. So I guess the there are going to be a number of challenges for him. I guess the challenge number one for me is really how to deal with the impact of the pandemic. The region is forecast or estimated to contract this year by 8.1, which is actually much more than most of the region. I guess the latest IMF estimates for developing countries were for 3.3. So there is going to be a much deeper contraction in Latin America. And I guess really the role for the US there is not only helping the recovery, in the kind of short-term recovery, but also helping the region really thinking of what should be the model going forward, the development model going forward, what should be a sustainable model which actually ensure that all those weaknesses we have seen with the pandemic, which have to do really with the fact that Latin America is a very unequal region. So you have seen basically the pandemic has hit really hard because of the large informal market, because of very, very unequal access to healthcare, but also to social security net. So I think there is really a need to look at this and say, okay, what is the inclusive model which could be adopted going forward? And I guess there is a lot of conversation in the region. There are lots of organizations spearheaded by ECLAC, which is the European Commission of the UN for Latin America, about what is this kind of new development model. How can you be really? How can you grow in a way which is sustainable and is based on inclusivity and equality? So I guess there the US has a role to play, but also has a role to play in terms of letting the organization, like for instance the Inter-American Development Bank, support in a very unbiased way the region. And I say that because there's been a very controversial election just before Trump. Just before the election, there's been the president of the IDB election was coming up, and traditionally this position would always go to a Latin American. But Trump made a case for Mauricio Claver Caron, which was actually responsible for Latin America, very hardcore and hardline towards Cuba and Venezuela, to be elected. So there's been actually this tendency on the Trump administration to also use this multilateral organization in the region as a tool of statecraft, right? So I think it's very important. The same you could say with the Organization of American States. If you remember last year, the report by this organization was instrumental in basically creating controversy in Bolivia after the election of Morales. So basically, there is this tendency, there is some allegation in terms of the role of the organization as a tool of U.S. power. So I think there's really the need for the U.S. to be much more supportive on this process, but also much more really respectful in the way in which the region will continue this process. I guess the other issue would be really helping the recovery and the new model through also using the supply chain. So we have seen that essential supply chain are very important to be closer to home. So in a way, it's a win-win. Obviously there is Mexico is there. Mexico is connected to the Pacific Alliance, Colombia, Peru, and so on and so forth. So there is actually opportunity to help the region and help the US at the same time by really developing this kind of trade links and this kind of supply chain across the region. I guess the other thing which is very important is really something which we haven't seen during Trump administration so much, which is really upholding the democratic value in the region as well. Because as I said. Trump hasn't really put any scrutiny on some kind of authoritarian drift we have seen in the region, and more during the COVID administration. If you look at the situation of the freedom of the press in El Salvador, in Mexico itself, in Brazil, there has really been in a way a disengagement from the U.S. and really defending the value for which it should stand, which is the democratic value and leaders. And I think this is even more important because next year there is what we could really call as an election super cycle in Latin America. You are going to have election in countries as key for migration and stability as El Salvador, Honduras. You're going to Nicaragua, Honduras, Ecuador. You're going to have election in Peru. You're going to have election in Chile. You're going to have midterm election in Mexico, which are going to be really important because it's really about also the process of. There's going to be a very important referendum that López Obrador has managed to approve, which is going to be also done at the same time of the midterm election, which is about whether we could persecute a former president. So I think it's very important here also to uphold democracy. There is the issue of Venezuela, which hasn't gone away. Obviously, we are in the situation whereby Venezuela is a main threat to regional stability. Not only in terms of flow of migrants, which are actually going to more, not really towards the US, but more towards South America, Colombia, Peru, Argentina, which has been a big issue. Like 6 million people almost have moved from Venezuela outside, but also, the involvement of other power in Venezuela, Iran, Russia, and I guess really there is what Trump has been doing, which is a really hardline policy towards Maduro and supporting Guaido, hasn't really worked. So I think there is really the need to think about what would be the alternative to that. And I guess it's going to be very tricky, I guess, for Biden, because also Biden has supported Guaido. But I guess there is an understanding of the fact that maybe policies which are more based on diplomacy and really pushing for fair election would be probably the best. And I guess Cuba, which is related to the Venezuela, because obviously it's Cuba is supporting Venezuela, but again, with intelligence, which is something which Venezuela really need, doctor and in many other ways. So I guess it's really a question of saying, okay, what do we do for Cuba? So is it a question of really, and again, I guess the Cuban issue and the hardline policies toward Cuba really justified, as we were saying, for domestic policy consideration about the Florida, which actually were very, very correct consideration on Trump part. But then again, there isn't really any reason to really be so hardline towards Cuba. And I think being hardline towards Cuba has also an impact on not solving the question of Venezuela. So I think there as well there will be some kind of changes. I would expect. And I guess the last challenge is really how to deal with China in the region, which is in the region, but everywhere in the world. But also in the region, what we have seen is really China making very important inroads in the region. I guess the disengagement of the US has really left the door open. So China is very much present in the region. You have 19 countries in Latin America which are part of the Belt and Road Initiative. You have China having actually lent something like 140 billion since 2005 to the region, which is actually more than what the IDB, the World Bank, and the CAF have lent to the region at the same time. Also, China is very much involved in the 5G deployment in the region. So I guess there is really the need for Biden in Latin America also to find a bit of modus vivendi with China. Like really, how do we deal with China? Realistically, it is now a bipolar world in Latin America, and I guess the US will have to find a way to really live with China in Latin America, and I guess internationally. So I guess those are all the issues. Migration obviously is going to be a big byproduct of all those instability in the region. I guess again, the big issue there is that Biden has already committed to an aid package of, I think, $4 billion to really help development and also democracy in Central America, which obviously it's one part of the equation which was really neglected by Trump. I guess there is a much bigger conversation and discussion, which is more about what do you do with drug policy, what do you do with the way in which you look at drugs. So is it really just the offer problem? It's really also demand and the fact that there are weapons going through the border. I don't know. I'm not sure whether there will be a a fundamental question or a fundamental change in that sense. Also because I guess it will also depends whether Trump, whether the Republicans are still in charge of Senate or whatever. I mean, I guess to some extent it will depend on how much margin to maneuver Biden has. But definitely, I think at least the fact of recognizing that drugs and the violence associated with drugs are actually have much deeper causes. It's already an improvement. So I guess if we again there is a really an effort from the U.S. to help development in the region and also to uphold the democratic leaders, I think that would be a big progress with respect to what we had in the past 4 years.
Lot to watch for, and of course also very much related to those important points you mentioned, the Pacific angle of relationships with Latin America, the issue around supply chains, competition with China in the region. What I think I'll be looking for, of course, is also how the U.S. perhaps might change its position towards the comprehensive and progressive agreement for the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So lots to look out for over the next 4 years, and really looking forward to your further insights on the region, Irene. Thank you.
Thanks, Meia.
Thank you so much for listening to this 2-part episode of Sound Strategic. We hope you enjoyed it, so please don't forget to follow, rate, and subscribe to Sound Strategic wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. And for all the latest analysis of international conflict, security, and defense issues, remember to follow the IISS on Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn, or to visit the IISS website. Thank you, and see you next time.